Welcome to Unlapped. We're back as we wrap up the first week of the autumn break, something that we're not used to. Usually we have the summer break. Right now we're in the autumn break. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. If you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so Nate, this autumn break that I just talked about, it's just this weird kind of consequential gap in the calendar between Singapore and the United States. So what's going on in F1? Because this isn't like the summer break where the teams actually properly shut down and people go on holiday.
Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? Because Christian Horner made that point. He was on the F1 Nation podcast this week, and he said we're all working still. Usually in the August break, it is literally that. 2 weeks where I didn't realize until very recently in my time covering Formula One that teams actually literally are shut out from their emails. They are physically unable to access their emails when they're on the beach or when they've taken the kids somewhere. This is different. This is just 3 weeks flat out. And given the state of the championship, you can imagine some of those teams are pretty flat out, hard at work at improving the car. And obviously for us, the difficulty becomes how do we fill the gap? Because usually we have races to bounce off of. Obviously, we had the Ricardo news last week. And I want to shout out, mate, before we get into the topics of the last couple of days, largely centered around Red Bull. We're running a piece today on ESPN, a chat with Charles Leclerc that you had a few weeks ago. Fantastic stuff. Really bullish from him saying, yeah, well, I'll let you explain it, but it sounds like he's pretty confident about a title challenge next season.
I just want to get from is it realistic that
Hmm.
in 2025 you challenge for titles? Or with Fred Vasseur coming in at the start of 23, is this actually a much longer project? Is it going to be 26, 27 when the regulations change? And he was very clear. I think it's always the case whenever you go to a Ferrari car launch, they say, well, we're targeting titles. That's what Ferrari does. But he was very clear that it's not only the target, it's a realistic target. And he answered it so frankly that it was almost a bit awkward because he was like,
But
great,
that's
well,
your
there's
lead
your
in, isn't it?
headline.
He's like, there's
He's
your
like,
headline. No.
there's your headline. Yeah,
Yeah,
run with
yeah.
it. So I thought, okay, well, I will run with that, but I'll try and put it in the context it deserves because it is a big deal. And then, of course, the other thing is Lewis Hamilton joining him as a teammate
Yeah.
next year. And Charles is such a nice guy, and I think any driver who has a new teammate coming in is always going to speak very highly of that new driver. They don't know really at this stage what they're going to be up against, apart from all the reputation that comes with the driver incoming. And with Lewis Hamilton, there is no high reputation in F1, 7 world titles, all the race victories, all the records, it speaks for itself. And so he really spoke in very kind of reverential terms about Lewis and all he's achieved, and also his excitement. And I genuinely believe this when he says that. I don't think he was just saying it to be nice, but his excitement of basically getting a chance to dig into Lewis's data, knowing
Mm.
that when they
Yeah.
went through, say, whatever it is, the S's at Suzuka or a slower corner like turn 3 in Austria, he will be able to look exactly at Lewis's data and then overlay it with his and know that they had exactly the same machine. Okay, if tire pressures were slightly different, he'll know that as well and get a true reading of where he stands against a driver who's achieved that much. And I was surprised by how genuinely excited Leclerc seemed about that. So I guess it does beg the question, though. Do we agree with Leclerc? Do we think that Ferrari will be ready as soon as next year? Remember, they've only won 3 races this year, better than 23, but still only 3 races compared to Max Verstappen's and McLaren so far. Do we think they're going to be ready to challenge for a title?
Well, my fear is with Charles being that bullish about the title and Lewis coming in, it immediately sets up what we've seen time and time again with Ferrari over this kind of past decade is incredibly high expectations. And you're right, the baseline is there, isn't it? Because let's not forget, McLaren last year hadn't won a race. Now they've won, what is it? Is it 4 races, 3 races? Ahead in the Constructors' Championship. But it's very easy to look at the McLaren story and say, oh, they've just come from nowhere to win. Zach Brown kind of revived the structure of that team behind the scenes a couple times before finally getting it right. And we know that guys like Laurence are moving with Lewis from Mercedes. You wonder whether those are the final pieces in the puzzle. Are they the pieces in the middle of the puzzle? Are they the beginning of that team? So I don't actually think we're going to be that clear on it until we start seeing races next season. But what this year has proved to us is that if Ferrari starts slowly, I think you can give them a bit of rope because McLaren started badly this year. I think under these new regulations, you're seeing teams are able to kind of make really big gains if they nail the upgrade. So huge pressure points for Ferrari, because if you get any of those steps wrong, if the team that Fred's built isn't quite ready yet, and you've got Lewis there, if you look at previous great teams, you bring in the great drivers just as you're ready to win. Lewis was brought in at Mercedes in 2013. They were ready to win in 14. Schumacher came in 96 at Ferrari. They didn't win a title until 2000, the year 2000, but they had a team ready to win the championship from 97 onwards. So yeah, you would hope that Lewis is the final piece of that puzzle, and the guys they're bringing in complete it. But to answer your question directly, I'm not convinced, because I think there's fundamentally we've seen there's just something lacking at Ferrari this season. Hard to put your finger exactly on what it is. I've been impressed with the leadership of Vasseur, but they've kind of just been lost in the shuffle this year, haven't they? And same with Mercedes can be said as well, to McLaren's credit. Those two teams came into the year and you thought, if either team is going to come close to Red Bull, or if any team is going to come close to Red Bull, it will be them. And McLaren's just leapt past both of them. And I think that they've just kind of been left in the dust a little bit. And you have to ask yourself why that is, because Ferrari have the same, if not better, resources than McLaren. McLaren only just got the wind tunnel sorted out, last season. So that should be a bit alarming. Maybe alarming is the wrong word. Maybe it's not crisis stuff, but it should definitely stand out as, a red flag. And not one with a prancing horse in the middle of it, just a pure red flag in terms of concern. But I mean, what do you think? Because I mean, I think all of us want Ferrari to be title contenders, and I think we've all been stung by it so much before. That's definitely in my head and my heart is that as much as you kind of want that to be a storyline, we've seen it. I mean, 2022, I remember, clear as day. We were convinced after 2 or 3 races this is the year, especially for Charles Leclerc, and then it just disappeared. So, what do you think? Is that likely, realistic, or are you in the same camp as me as not 2025 at least?
Well, I think it's tantalizingly close, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it's the same for all of those 4 teams, is that it's really on an average weekend, a couple of temps, 3 temps that make the difference in qualifying. And then you're right, it's, as you mentioned, those upgrades, whether they work or not. And it seemed that as Ferrari kind of, got into the season, they looked like second best behind Red Bull. Then Red Bull started to waver a bit. And it was the upgrade I think Ferrari bought around the time of the Spanish Grand Prix. It just didn't put the team forward in the way they wanted. Then they started having to go backwards. And this is the same problem that actually every team, I think, has had in Formula One this year, with the exception of McLaren. And so, Red Bull has had this problem. They've brought upgrades to the car that haven't worked. Mercedes have, at one stage, looked like they'd kind of found the perfect set of upgrades to push them forward. But then they introduced a new floor. It was just before the summer break, and again, it would seem to be that step backwards. And they've had to go back on that, understand it, and move forward. So it's really just whether you can pick this momentum to go forward. And I don't think the simulations that the teams have back at the factory, the wind tunnel and the CFD, and then how that converts into their simulator, necessarily pick up on all the very small nuances that this set of regulations can expose, and a lot of the time that comes down to pure driver confidence. So if a driver is unable to go into a high-speed corner knowing that the car's going to stick, all of a sudden they lose that confidence, they lose those couple of tenths of a second, and that is the difference over a race weekend. So this is why I can see where Leclerc's coming from. He's saying, look, I'm got growing confidence. And he was talking in Baku, remember, just after that Monza victory. So he was probably riding a bit of a wave in terms of confidence. But I think he felt like, we've just started to kind of make that progress again. Probably if you talked to him after Singapore, I'm sure he still would have given the same answer, but maybe he would have been a little bit more considered in how he answered it, and kind of this recognition that it's not a constant upwards trajectory right now. There's always going to be a little dip and then another up and then a little dip. But as long as those ups outweigh the dips as you go, then that's important. But the other thing he did point out in the article, and a quote I included, was that it is also relative to the competitors. So yeah, again, it's a very long-winded answer to not really give an answer at all. But I think it is there. It's possible. But I kind of agree. Right now, with this regulation set, the way it's going, do I have more confidence in Ferrari to get that right than I do over McLaren, Red Bull, and Mercedes? I wouldn't say so. I mean,
Yeah.
I'd say I've got confidence that they'll be thereabouts, but the way that McLaren have been able to add performance to that car again and again and again is really impressive. But a big kind of potential turning point on all of that will be the US Grand Prix in Austin. Still got a few weeks to wait for it, but so many teams are bringing their last big upgrade of 2024 there, including McLaren. And while
Yeah,
McLaren are
that's
pretty
big.
confident, I think they're pretty confident they're going to deliver a decent chunk of performance to the car. At the back of their minds, and Andrea Seller's been open about this, there's still the possibility that you don't quite get it right, and then you have to backtrack, and then you start questioning some of the assumptions you've made with designing your car and your development
And
trajectory over time.
Red Bull's a great example of that this year. We assumed, oh, they're locked in now at the front. They'll be there forever. And then suddenly, the combination of them maybe taking some missteps and other people doing it right, it's changed everything. I just to add to your point finally, before we put a bow on the Ferrari conversation, I'm fascinated by the dynamic shift that Lewis will bring because across any sports, I think it's so understated how important experience of actually winning championships is. And if you look across Ferrari, got some incredible minds there. Do you say how many people have actually won championships in that team? Yeah, in Formula One, even Fred Vasseur, as respected and as good as he is, I think there's a difference when you're finally placed in that situation. So Lewis coming across, and he's bringing a couple of guys with him from Mercedes. That will be huge, I think, and it will be really fascinating to see if the kind of the push from Lewis behind the scenes, and you'd imagine it'd be quite a targeted push towards, I know what works. I know how to win championships. I've seen this at Mercedes. Will that be a help or will that be a hindrance? Because obviously he's coming into a team that's been doing things their own way for a long time. I think that will actually be a very telling part of their season. And whether that's a clash that Ferrari doesn't need or whether that's actually the final kind of impetus to take that step forward, we'll see. But I think that's been an understated part of the move so far is that you finally got someone walking into Maranello who can say, I've won championships. I've seen how teams do it. And here's where we're lacking. And if Lewis Hamilton's telling you that, it's really difficult to say no, isn't it? It's really difficult to turn around and say, no, we don't believe you. It's like, well, check my Wikipedia page out and see how many wins and championships are there. Compare them to Ferrari drivers from the past 10 years. So that I think is going to be a really key part of that move. And to the point of your article that we've currently got on ESPN.com, I think Leclerc can benefit from that. And I think it's great as well to see him acknowledge that. Sometimes drivers say, I'm not going to learn anything. It's like, come on, clearly you will. And I think it just adds to the likability of Charles Leclerc that he's kind of got this boyish enthusiasm to drive next to an all-time great, and it doesn't feel within him to say no, I'm better than Lewis. I don't need because some drivers you might imagine that coming. So yeah, really cool to see. And I think that's all we're going to be talking about next year, isn't it? If Ferrari win a race, hype train central, and then we're just like off to the races basically. But yeah, great stuff, mate. I really enjoyed reading that, and yeah, people who want to check that out, ESPN.com/Formula One, and yeah, it's sorry, F1, not Formula One. I don't know where that would take you. /F1.
Yeah, I hope he's the same place, but we never tried
Yeah,
it. So
you'd imagine it all
go.
redirects somewhere to the same place.
The other thing we found ourselves writing about pretty much since we got back from Singapore is Daniel Ricciardo leaving RB. Of course, I mean, I think everything that can be said about that we talked about a lot in the last podcast. But let's also look to Liam Lawson and what's going to happen over these next 6 races. A lot of pressure, I think, going in there. He said that. He's also said he did an interview with the New Zealand Herald or Tribune, I can't remember which one, saying that basically there's no guarantees for next year. He is there having to prove himself in these 6 races. He doesn't see it as a guaranteed stay beyond that. But of course, the ceiling's very high. The possibility is that he performs so well that Red Bull look at him and they look at Checo Perez and they decide, well, if Perez continues to not perform over the next 6 races and Lawson looks fantastic next to Yuki Tsunoda, then I think that's going to force their hand a bit to make a change as well. So Nate, I mean, how much pressure has he got and what's a realistic expectation for Lawson over these final 6 races?
Well, I think it's night and day to last year when he was stepped in to Ricardo to replace Ricardo for 5 races, because the bar was nowhere last year, was it? He'd come in. No one really knew much about Liam Lawson unless you'd really followed the junior series closely. And to his credit, the reason we're sat here having this conversation about him is because of how well he did in those 5 races. It put him into the frame. It changed the whole dynamic of that of that conversation behind the scenes. As much as we have said, and it is true that there's a struggle between Marco and Horner there, Liam Lawson's not part of that struggle if he didn't impress last season. So full credit to him for doing that. But I think you're right. The pressure now has changed fundamentally because similarly to what was with Ricardo, the problem with Ricardo, his return was always framed as, can he replace Sergio Perez? And it was such a lofty goal, wasn't it? Of this is the absolute maximum and everyone wants him and expects him to do it. Liam Lawson's down in that similar position now. And Yuki proved to be a bit of trouble for Ricardo in doing that because, you know, if you get Yuki's a very, very good driver, as we all know. If you're not beating Yuki Tsunoda, immediately you lose that kind of shout of I should replace Perez. So I think the pressure's huge. And to be honest with you, from the sample that we have of Liam Lawson, I think he's going to rise to the challenge really well because he stepped in really difficult circumstances last season. He's one of these. He strikes me. I mean, he's very similar to a Bearman or a Colapinto in that these young guys now. It's unbelievable, isn't it? You talk to them and they're so cool. They're you know I'm sure they are nervous at points during weekends, but they definitely don't show it to us in the media. And you know, given what they're stepping into, they seem incredibly well prepared for that. So I think he's going to do okay. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that these 6 races now, I don't think there's. I think arguably the microscope is on him bigger than it was ever on Ricardo because he's not only going for that Perez seat, but he's also replaced Ricardo. So it's like it's added an element to the Ricardo story that Ricardo didn't have. I know Ricardo replaced Nick De Vries, but Nick De Vries was never really seen as anything like, you know, a potential Perez candidate, and obviously didn't have the popularity of Ricardo. So there's so many levels that Red Bull have kind of, I suppose, inadvertently added to this that it's sky high. But yeah, I think he'll do very well. And what a headache to give Red Bull if he does do well, because I think they're genuine about that. The announcement didn't say anything about 2025. We all expected that Ricardo was going to make way for him in 25. I think that is still the plan if he doesn't do enough to replace Perez. But the fact that wasn't mentioned has kept that door wide open. And you used the word tantalizing to describe Ferrari earlier. I think it's tantalizing for Liam Lawson how close that prospect of that Red Bull seat would be. And imagine that, just to close this, because again I'm waffling again about Liam Lawson, but imagine if he was able to do that without a full season under his belt. It would be remarkable. He would have done 5 races one season, 6 races at the next. I think that's one of the reasons Red Bull chose now to do it as well, because if you think last season he went up to Singapore, now they've started after Singapore, so you've effectively given yourself data's worth of, you know, just over half of the season. I'm sure they're not looking at it as cut and dry as that, but it means they've got the perfect sample size they need. But yeah, it'll be quite a story. And I think Red Bull, given what Perez has been performing at doing results wise, I think they need all the help they can get. So yeah, definitely a compelling story for us to keep following this season.
Well, let's just move it on to Checo, because I mean, Sergio Perez is a driver we've talked about the whole season, because throughout there's been questions about his future. You know, we're talking about this autumn break now, but during the summer break, we went into that not knowing whether he would still be there coming out of it, which is crazy now when you think, you know, presumably it would have been presumably it would have been Ricardo that got promoted. I mean, maybe Lawson would have gone straight in there, but even so, that would have meant that Ricardo would still be in F1 going into his final 6 races. But all a load of what ifs. But it was quite telling, wasn't it? And I'm not entirely sure where this came from, but it seemed that there were a few rumours over the Singapore Grand Prix weekend that perhaps Checo too was being lined up for an exit from F1. And I think the rumour was that he would be allowed to announce it in Mexico. I didn't hear that rumor when I was in.
Didn't hear that.
Maybe because I'm not as well connected.
I mean, maybe we were just inundated with Ricardo rumors. We didn't hear the Perez ones, but yeah, I didn't hear it either.
Well, I mean, certainly that's where the focus I felt was. It was on Ricardo. It wasn't on Checo over that weekend, and the pressure was on Ricardo as well. But Checo still went on social media in this last week and seemingly addressing those rumors. Posted a tweet of the "I'm not leaving" scene from Wolf of Wall Street. What do you think, Nate? Where does this leave us? Because, I mean, Checo's been fairly consistent throughout this. I remember even ahead of the summer break, he was saying, look, I know what my contract says. I know where I'm going to be. You guys can talk all you want. So how safe is that seat? And what does he have to do in the final 6 races of this year?
So difficult to speak with any clarity on Perez's situation, isn't it? You know, you mentioned the summer. I feel like we all thought one thing going into the summer break. something very different happened coming out of that, that first day when Red Bull kind of said he's safe. I mean, you've got to look at it, I think, as he's safe until the end of the year. And in the context of the Lawson conversation we had, I don't know if you can say anything beyond that. I know he signed a new deal this year to go to the end of next season, but we've seen with Daniel Ricciardo what Red Bull contracts mean in terms of how easy they can be shifted or rewritten or whatever, or just torn up completely. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'd love to know what you think about this because you've covered the sport a little bit longer than me as well. But I always find it fascinating when drivers feel the need to respond to rumors because, like you said, a lot of people would not have seen that. I went looking for it, and it was on Twitter. There always seems to be some rumor going around on Twitter that one random website's picked up. But him referencing it, I think, was actually quite telling. I think it shows you that he's acutely aware of the conversation that's going on around him all the time and to respond to it. Sometimes you almost think, just don't respond to it. If you are as safe as you say you are, you don't feel the need to respond. I don't know. That was my kind of take on it. I wonder if you had the same feeling or anything like that.
Well, I think that is often the advice given to drivers, and it's often the advice taken by drivers because, for the most part, unless there's an actual statement to be made about their future, they don't do it. I actually welcome it because, I mean,
Yeah,
not
it's good
least
for us.
because, I mean, it's good for us. It's good for keeping news stories ticking over. But I also welcome it because it shows this other side to drivers that we now know is a Wolf of Wall Street fan. It's just kind of use of cultural references. I think it's good. And I don't think if his situation was precarious, like genuinely precarious right now, he would have done that because I think then it would have all of a sudden been a bit more serious. But you also never know exactly the situation the driver's in. How much do they pay attention to social media? Again, I think the advice usually is don't look at it, just steer clear of it.
Yeah,
Don't
avoid.
get, yeah, just avoid it and try not to, get your head stuck in any kind of dark places where you're reading all these rumors about you. But then also, yeah, you don't know. Perhaps like one of his friends showed it to him over dinner, and then he kind of looked a little bit closer. And also that Mexican fan base is so passionate about Perez and about his position at Red Bull and about his potential at Red Bull. And I feel like when he first went there, it was genuinely exciting because one of the things we said and could still happen in a few weeks' time is imagine if Perez wins the Mexican Grand Prix
Mm,
in front of the same fans. Like, what a story that would be! What a party that would be! And so, yeah, I think sometimes it's a case of a driver just responding to their fan base a bit, kind of. But I don't think he would have put it out if he wasn't confident in his position right now. And as you say, given everything that's happened over the last week, the fact that the man that Red Bull appointed to the RB seat to evaluate as his potential replacement. And we're very open about that. It's very clear right from the start. The reason Daniel Ricciardo is getting a shot at this is because Checo is struggling and we need to know whether we've got a potential replacement if we need it. And also, I think the idea was to give Checo a bit of a boot, like get him driving at a better level with a little bit of pressure, see if that works on him. I'm not sure that has worked because Checo's performances this year,
yeah.
for a multitude of reasons, haven't been where they should be. But still, I feel like right now he probably feels more confident than he has done for a while because in that merry-go-round of, or having basically 4 seats and 5 drivers floating around them, that pool is now 4 seats and 4 drivers. So unless Red Bull feel very strongly about Isaac Hadjar, their F2 driver, making the step up next year, and I get the impression they're not 100% sure on that, then I think Checo's seat is probably safe. But he'll have to keep an eye on Lawson. Like you said, if Lawson performs, I think Yuki is an incredibly good benchmark, and I'm actually always quite upset that I feel it comes from Red Bull and Christian Horner that he's not considered as a genuine contender to drive for Red Bull. But Yuki is a very high benchmark. So if Lawson does start to outperform him, then yeah, maybe Perez will have to start thinking again. Right, okay, let's wrap up the week's news because it has been surprisingly busy for an off week in Formula One. And the news that we knew it was coming, but we've had confirmation now that Renault will no longer make their own power units from 2026 onwards. There's a lot to unpack here, but what's your initial takeaway from this decision?
Well, I mean, this is years of I think failure is the right word for the Renault project, isn't it? You know, when they came back in, was it 2016 or 17? The goal was we're going to win championships in the decade we're in right now and already be in that, you know, by the new engine regs, you know, be well established. And they've won one race in that time. So it was always inevitable, especially as soon as Flavio Briatore came back, you know, to F1 earlier this year. But yeah, I mean, just a really kind of a really sad story in a way, isn't it? You know, you've got this great famous manufacturer, you know, this kind of quite famous factory. You know, that I mean, they've built some great things over time. Renault, you know, they've won championships as a fully fledged manufacturer. You know, building their own team and building their own engines. And yeah, it just to have finished so underwhelmingly, I think is a real shame, you know, and the whole I think that we could do a whole podcast on how poorly mismanaged that whole project's been from the beginning, pretty much. But yeah, a shame, and obviously we dealt, didn't we, with some of the employees that were sending us statements during the Monza weekend about the protests that they were doing about this expected news at the time, which has now been confirmed. So it's never nice when, you know, a huge group of people have kind of either lost their job or have lost you know, the focus that they're passionate on doing. But not surprising either, is it? Because there's just not been the success that Renault needs. And if you compare to the other two companies in Formula One that do what Renault was doing, which is Ferrari and Mercedes, in terms of having a team and building its own engines from scratch, I mean, Ferrari has won races at least, you know, sprinkling of races. Mercedes won championship after championship after championship, and they did it on the back of the setup between their two factories. Now, I think there's a wider point here of, do we think a modern team, a modern fully fledged manufacturer can actually operate the way Alpine and Renault did between Enstone in the UK and Viry in France? I know that nowadays with Zoom calls and stuff, that's a lot easier, but it still creates its own little issues, you know, around the way. And Ferrari have always remained, you know, other than they had a small spell with John Barnard in the 80s and 90s, but it was a complete disaster, you know, split between two countries. So I've always thought that's quite an interesting dynamic there. But yeah, just not surprising. But it really just shows you kind of how far that team has fallen, I think, because to go not just from Renault, you've then rebranded yourself to Alpine. It was meant to be this whole big thing of Alpine's now the great big brand. We're now going to go and take Mercedes engines. It's such a humiliating admission that we can't build engines as well as effectively a rival in the automotive industry can. So yeah, really, really kind of just horrible if you're a fan of Renault, but has been on the wall for a long, long time.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that it is a failure because most teams would want to have either a works power unit or an entirely in-house one, you know, owned by the same company. And to your point about having the gap, the geographical gap between them, well, the Red Bull Honda one, you know, once Honda got it right, it worked. But I think the thing you've got to look at Renault is that it seems like for a long time they've been trying to do it on a shoestring budget in comparison to the other manufacturers they're up against. So it's not to say they haven't invested heavily in it. It's not to say they haven't got a bunch of talented people there, but it always just felt like they started off this regulation cycle in 2014 one step behind with their engine, and they never really put that investment that was needed, that full commitment that was needed to turn that around. And so, yeah, you know, you end up with this thing that should be an advantage. A works engine should be an advantage, and for the last few seasons, it's actually held them back, especially since we had the engine freeze leading into the next set of engine regulations, whereby a disadvantage of about 20 brake horsepower or so has been locked in. And, you know, and that's big in Formula One. So I think that just goes to show that while, you know, this does feel a little bit like a kind of, you know, quick decision, a decision made on, well, we're not performing now and therefore we're not going to be in the future. Actually, if you look at it, you know, this is the result of a lot of, you know, underinvestment and not quite the level of commitment that's needed, which is ridiculous as well, because it's not like they haven't spent a lot of money on it. You know, it's just that they haven't quite spent enough to match the likes of Mercedes, Honda, and Ferrari. And then going forward, you know, I mean, the flip side to that whole argument is that, well, if you look at McLaren, they're doing perfectly well with Mercedes engines in the back. So, you know, you can do it as a customer, and perhaps the days of needing to be a works engine are are no longer here. But I think going into 2026 of all times, that's when Alpine should have been targeting a long time ago to make the progress, and perhaps just the results weren't coming back from what they were doing on the 26 engine, and they knew they were going to be in trouble. But I don't know. I mean, where do you think it leaves Alpine as a Formula One team? Because of course the teams will still exist, still be run out of Enstone. We believe it's going to be Mercedes engines in the back, which from 2026 could well be the most competitive power units on the grid. That's kind of the general assumption and the rumors that we've been hearing over the last year or so. So do you think this could actually put them in a more competitive position, or do you think this is just signifier of the fact that they aren't doing it the right way from the very bare bones, from the very basics, and therefore they're probably never going to be a true title contender?
I think, yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I think what it suggests is that people in the race operation have squarely blamed the engine department for the failings of that team. And I think that, the more you work in Formula One, the more you realize that I think the whole race operation has been flawed for a long time as well. So I think getting Mercedes engines in, it should make them more competitive, to your point. But I can't see, if the race operation is still not functioning, if the leadership is still not perfect. And again, that's not a comment on Ollie Oakes. We don't know what his effect will be. But what we've seen with Alpine has kind of been this very rudderless team operating for a long, long time. And I think that goes deeper than an engine deal with any team. I wonder whether it's kind of window dressing this team, and Renault pulling out now. Do they look at it and say, well, we've got this very, very expensive asset that we can sell? We know the interest that there's been from Andretti in America. I'm sure there'll be other entities interested, especially as Formula One has basically said your best way to enter is to buy a team, not to actually come in yourself. Suddenly, Renault now has basically said, look, we don't think we can win as 100% Renault. You can imagine the conversations in a boardroom now being like, well, look, do we just kind of cut this story short and say, look, let's make some money. They'll make a lot of money getting out of Formula One, more than they arguably would have made, well, a lot more than they would have made selling a few years ago. Recoup a lot of money they may have lost over the last few years.
I think there's signs it's going that way. We should probably say that when the high ups in Renault, I've been asked about it. They've said that the Alpine race team is not for sale, and that they still believe in this Alpine brand, which of course is going to become a kind of electric car brand going forward, dealing with kind of high performance electric cars from under the Renault kind of overall group Renault company. So yeah, that's what it's done. But it's one of those things where I feel like we'll start to get a view of that in the next few years or so, but I don't think we're going to get an instant answer on that. And I think they're probably going to sit tight and know that the value of any F1 team at the moment is fairly stable because of this kind of fairly franchise system we have, the fact that Andretti have been batted away, and the fact that there's a budget cap in place now. So even if they continue to run just the F1 team, just the chassis side for a little bit longer, they can probably make a bit of profit off it before looking to sell it and get it in the best possible place to do it, if that's what they're planning to do. But
yeah, it's interesting as well, isn't it, with them, because they're the team that's had some of the highest profile investment that we've seen in terms of just outright celebrity names. We've obviously had McElroy, Rob McElhaney, I think Travis Kelce was involved, Anthony Joshua, involved with these kind of consortiums that were getting involved with the team. And you wonder how those deals will shift going forward. Are people going to start looking to kind of get out of that? Is this they're actually at the race in Austin or at the race in Vegas? Because yeah, I think that clearly outside of Formula One, regardless of how you're doing, it's still so attractive right now to be investing in Formula One. So I think to your point, it is so smart that what they've done is they said, right, let's get rid of the obvious bit we can get rid of now, the big money drain, the big thing that's clearly costing us results. Because I mean, what was it, about 3 years ago, Renault were like, yeah, look, we are a bunch of horsepower down on the next nearest engine, which was a huge admission for them to make. So yeah, I think this could be the start of a turnaround. But I still, yeah, the Alpine brand still to me just hasn't really resonated in the way that I think they wanted it to. But I wonder whether this helps them now. They've got a bit more of a focus on just the team. They don't have to worry so much about performance in terms of if there are performance issues, they can kind of say, well, look, we're dealing with that with Mercedes. Here's the Alpine brand. Here's what we're doing. And again, that might strengthen their case down the line to either sell or to kind of, I guess, reinvest some energy and some resources into the team.
Well, the next time we'll be back will likely be before the US Grand Prix. So until then, keep checking ESPN.com for all the news that we get during this autumn break, and we'll be back to discuss all of it next time round.